It began with the ledger. Bound in leather, torn at the spine, and speckled with iron rust too old to explain, the book contained 314 names. Each entry was paired with a date, a destination, and a final column marked with a simple dash, until page 47, where the dashes turned to black ink crosses. After that, there were no more entries, no conclusion. Just a torn scrap of muslin tucked between the pages, and a note scribbled in hurried hand. Do not dig near the east wall. It does not forgive the ledger was found in 1901, bricked into a chimney cavity of a collapsed farmhouse in eastern Kentucky. The property had long since passed into state hands, listed only as Morrison Parcel Number 9, and the farmhouse, once known locally as Morrison's Rest, had already decayed into skeletal beams and silt. But the date on the first page of the ledger was much older, May 3rd, 1834. For nearly 70 years, no one could make sense of the entries. Travellers, boarders, and wagon-bound merchants, all logged, none confirmed to have reached their destinations. Then, in 1908, a local archivist cross-referenced the list with missing person notices printed in the Lexington Herald during the 1830s. 12 names matched. 4 were found in neighbouring states, but 3, including a widow named Lydia Eames, whose last known location was lodging east of Irvine, had never been accounted for. And so began the whispers of Morrison Farm. Some called it the kindest rest, a roadside lodging that fed weary travellers with a generosity no one could afford. Others referred to it as the disappearing house, because no map before 1890 marks its coordinates. And then came the legends. Cannibalism, cult rites, vagrants boiled down to bone broth. The details shifted from decade to decade, but the seed always remained. Something had been fed to guests that should never have passed human lips. In the summer of 1926, construction workers levelling the land for a road-widening project uncovered a second ledger. This one was half-burned, waterlogged, and wrapped in what appeared to be sheep's wool stitched with human hair. It contained only 6 pages and a single surviving sentence. No famine ever touched us, for we always welcomed strangers. What happened at Morrison Farm between 1834 and 1854, and why no one stopped it, is still a matter of fierce debate. Was it simply a forgotten lodging house, abandoned like so many others along Kentucky's rural wagon routes? Or was it something darker, a quiet mechanism for disposing of the desperate, the voiceless, the ones who wouldn't be missed? This story is not verified by any official court record. It does not appear in US criminal archives, and no living descendant of the Morrison family has ever acknowledged its truth. But the ledgers exist. So do 3 privately held artifacts: a carved tin serving tray, a set of mismatched bone-handled knives, and a handwritten inventory of guest belongings recovered during an estate auction in 1973. So we begin with a simple contract. This is a dramatized story inspired by unverified historical accounts. Every claim made in this story will be presented with a plausible archival source, a physical artifact, or an authority of record, real or constructed for coherence. We will walk through what could have happened, not what certainly did. And we'll ask one question again and again: why were they never stopped? Because whether the Morrison farm existed or not, history is full of vanished places. And sometimes, what those places fed on was us. Before we enter, a simple request. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you in a city? A farmhouse? Somewhere between? If this kind of story is for you, dark, but always grounded, subscribe for more narratives drawn from history's half-buried corners. Let's begin. The earliest known reference to Morrison's Rest appears in a travel log dated June 18, 1835. The entry belongs to Ezekiel Dorr, a wool merchant from Marion, Ohio, who was journeying southward toward the Tennessee border. His journal, preserved today in the Special Collections Wing of the University of Kentucky, recounts a stormy night, impassable roads, and what he called a miraculous haven near the Red Lick Ridge. He describes arriving just past dusk, rain turning the clay to syrup beneath his cartwheels. He had expected to sleep in his wagon. Instead, he was waved down by a young boy holding a lantern. No older than 10, Dorr writes, who led him down an unmarked path to a farmhouse, white as bone in the dark. They had stew ready, and bread too warm to have come from a cold oven. They asked no questions. They only asked how hungry I was. That entry is dated June 18th, 1835. The next entry in Dorr's journal is June 21st, 3 days later, and it begins with a single line. I remember little of my departure, only that the boy was gone and the road had changed. For years, this detail was considered minor, a lapse in memory, or perhaps the product of fever. But a 1979 university thesis by graduate researcher Hannah Whitlock raised a startling point. No known road or township record places a lodging house, or any structure, within 5 miles of the ridge at Redlick in 1835. And Dorr's notes show no signs of illness, confusion or inebriation in the days prior. Then there's the date discrepancy. In his inventory logbook, which Dorr submitted quarterly to his Merchants Guild, his stay is listed as June 18th to 19th. But his personal diary skips directly to the 21st. 2 entire days, unaccounted for, and Dorr was not the only one. Another case surfaces in 1842, this time a pastor named William Shearer, travelling on foot between Irvine and McKee. His church correspondence, preserved in the First Baptist Archives, notes that he was delayed in his journey after taking shelter at a roadside lodge kept by the kind Morrisons. He thanked them specifically for nourishment that gave no ache. But according to the Baptist Quarterly Dispatch dated July 1842, Shearer's detour was never approved. No such inn was sanctioned on that route, and he was reprimanded for failing to arrive at the Sunday sermon in McKee without cause. He would later describe that brief stay as a pause in time, claiming that his watch had stopped and never restarted. When Whitlock laid these two accounts side by side in her thesis, she proposed a strange possibility that the Morrison farm may have operated entirely off record, avoiding land registries, tax filings, and township inspection for at least 2 decades. But how? And more importantly, why? This brings us to the first impossibility. In 1992, while cleaning the attic of her late grandfather's estate, a woman named Melinda Cray discovered a wooden box sealed with tar. Inside were folded linen scraps, brittle from age, and a stack of correspondences, including one addressed to a Miss L. Eames, Eastern Kentucky. The letter, dated June 9, 1834, welcomed her for an extended stay as a relief guest. We do not charge coin, it read, only companionship and stories for the hearth. Cray turned over the letters to the Appalachian Historical Society, where archivists authenticated the paper, ink and seal as period appropriate. But the most curious detail lay in the return address. It read, Morrison's Rest Unnamed Track off Estill Trace County, not yet decided. The year was 1834. Estill County had been formally incorporated since 1808, a location that didn't claim a county, a road that never existed on maps, a house that served food no one ever saw cooked, and a pattern of missing time, halted watches, and ledger entries with no exits. These are the first cracks, small, barely audible. But as we move forward, the walls will widen, the names will multiply, and the silences, those blank spaces where record should be, will begin to make noise. The first official document to reference Morrison's Rest appeared nearly 30 years after the farm was presumed abandoned. It was a property seizure notice filed in June of 1883 by the Commonwealth of Kentucky pertaining to Parcel 113, jurisdiction disputed, located near what is now Furnace Mountain Road, 10 miles east of Irvine. The document, held in the state archives, records a failed attempt to claim the land due to insufficient ownership documentation, absence of living heir, and persistent local protest. The property's legal ambiguity raised immediate questions. According to the filing, the original deed was issued in 1833, yet no trace of that document has surfaced. County clerks across Estill, Lee and Owsley counties were consulted. Each denied any record of a Morrison family receiving or transferring land in that area. What emerged instead were fragments of mentions, indirect references, scattered across unrelated legal texts. One appeared in the 1848 case of Commonwealth versus Breyer, a civil dispute regarding fencing and livestock encroachment. A witness, Samuel Blight, described his walk past a house that served up generous stew to strangers, but kept no sign above its door. When asked under oath for the location, he replied, "Just west of the fork near the White Stone, what they call Morrison's Patch." This testimony, recorded in the 1848 Estill County Court transcript, case number 429, is one of the earliest legal mentions of the farm by name. But what's more revealing is the judge's margin note, scrawled in faded ink. Witness appears certain, but no such lodging exists on record. Refer to township maps. Those maps, archived in Frankfurt, show only forest and rough topography where the witness described. No plotted structures, no tax trails, just a gap. Then came the doctors. In 1852, the Kentucky State Medical Register logged an unusual complaint from physician Dr. Elias Roth, who claimed to have been summoned by a rider to treat a seizure in a middle-aged boarder at a quiet house near the Trace. The house was not named, but the location given, East Fork of Little Doe Creek, unmarked road through White Ash, places it squarely within the coordinates now believed to correspond to Morrison's Rest. Dr. Roth's notes, filed as part of his medical ledger, entry dated June 12, 1852, described the scene. No signs of seizure found. Patient was missing. Hosts declined access to lower rooms. Told me the light upsets our old ones. I left at dawn. Roth did not file a complaint. In his own words, he didn't wish to interfere with the odd customs of people who offer you soup at midnight. But his ledger contains a chilling annotation. A name, Lydia Eames, is circled on the adjacent page, next to the words, "I've heard this name before." Once. Never again. Why a physician would scribble a guest's name with such emphasis, especially a name that appears in the Morrison ledger, is unclear. But what is clear is this. The authorities knew. They may not have known in full, but sheriffs, clerks and doctors passed through that region. They saw enough to notice, and they recorded fragments, legal testimony, patient logs, geographic contradictions, that all pointed towards something that wasn't supposed to exist, and yet did. In 1861, the Estill County Treasurer's Report noted a small, unexplained disbursement, $2.60, paid to Mr. Amos Prine for burning unknown personal effects from an abandoned dwelling near Furnace Root. That is the only reference to a state-sponsored disposal of material within those woods. No further inquiry was filed. The house, it seems, had been erased, but it left behind paperwork, and paperwork, unlike wood, does not burn so easily. These documents don't tell us what happened behind the doors of Morrison's Rest, but they tell us something more important. It was real enough to notice, and strange enough to ignore. Authorities placed their hands near the fire and recoiled. So we ask again, why was it left untouched? In the winter of 1973, a private estate auction in Beattyville, Kentucky offered a collection of nondescript household items: weathered chairs, broken tools, bundles of threadbare linens. Among the lots, item number 46 drew minor attention from a regional antique dealer. A shallow wooden tray carved from walnut with faint floral etchings and an inscription at the base that read, "For the guests who stay." The dealer, George Lafferty, purchased the tray for $8, believing it to be late 19th century. But while cleaning it weeks later, he noticed something odd. Beneath a layer of resin and soot on the underside, etched into the wood, was a faint serial. Number 9, Inventory of Rations, 1839. That single number led Lafferty to contact the Appalachian Historical Society, where archivist Beryl Mattingly cross-referenced the serial with a forgotten inventory log found decades earlier. A hand-copied index titled, "Belongings Left by Passing Guests." The original log listed a variety of mundane items: gloves, brooches, pens, walking sticks, with corresponding numbers. Entry number 9 was noted simply as "serving tray," engraved, "held for Lydia." The name Lydia appears in several Morrison-related documents, but this was the first physical link between an object and an alleged guest. That same year, a second object surfaced. During renovations to a 19th-century barn near Turkey Knob, a carpenter discovered a leather-bound recipe book wrapped in oilcloth and wedged into a hollow beam above the loft. The book, brittle and water-damaged, contained only 5 legible entries. All were soups. None listed meat sources, only cryptic ingredients like the root beneath the ribs and fat of the uncounted. Scholars have long debated whether the book is authentic or an elaborate hoax. But the handwriting, when compared with a verified Morrison ledger entry from 1836, bore 6 point-by-point matches in slant, stroke, and spacing. The Society's forensic handwriting analyst called the likelihood of coincidence highly improbable. Inside the back cover of the book, in faded pencil, was a single line: "The broth must never boil loud." It listens. Then there's the knives. In 1986, a woman named Darlene Rose, while clearing out her late uncle's shed near the old Red Lick Trail, uncovered a cloth-wrapped bundle of bone-handled knives tucked in a rusted tobacco tin. Each blade was marked with notches, none matching. The largest knife, a carving blade, bore 3 incised initials near the hilt: LEM. The Kentucky Historical Registry catalogued the find and dated the bone handles to the 1830s. More disturbingly, the carving knife bore the remains of what analysts called a dark flaked residue, proteinous in nature, though testing in the 1980s was too limited to confirm origin. The knives were stored, the results inconclusive, the initials unverified. But one detail, noted in the registry's intake log, stands out. The cloth in which the knives were wrapped, aged linen, near disintegration, bore a faint stitched phrase at the hem: "Welcome, traveller." Rest 3 unrelated discoveries, across 3 counties, over 13 years. None marked or sold as connected, none advertised as valuable, yet each bearing a piece of the same story. Even if we set aside the speculation, the folklore, the whispered legends of what the Morrison family fed their guests, these items should not exist in isolation. Too precise, too aligned, too persistent in surfacing when no one was searching. The past doesn't often offer confessions, but sometimes it leaves clues. Wood, bone, ink, all quietly whispering the same name. By the early 1900s, most traces of Morrison's rest had faded into the soil, literally and figuratively. The structure itself had collapsed under the weight of 2 unrelenting winters and 1 long-forgotten brush fire. The paths leading to it were choked with honeysuckle, and the land was no longer mapped to any name. But in 1907, an excavation crew widening Red Lick Trace unearthed a buried cistern near the coordinates believed to align with the former homestead. Inside were charred fragments of wood, oxidized iron hooks, and a bent ladle sealed in lard. More curiously, the cistern was lined with bricks stamped R.F. & Sons 1834, a maker's mark from a local kiln that ceased operation in 1836. At first, no one linked the find to Morrison's rest. It wasn't until the following spring when a local preacher named Harlan Beck, researching county folklore for a historical sermon, found mention of the silent pot under the roots in a faded letter from the 1840s. That reference aligned precisely with the crew's excavation report. Beck published his findings in the Estill County Gazette, including a controversial assertion. The Morrison family, if real, were not merely innkeepers. They were harvesters of flesh, spiritual or physical. Either metaphor holds. Both disturb. It was the first time the cannibalism theory appeared in public print. Within weeks, backlash followed. Beck was asked to step down from the pulpit after members of his congregation objected to what they saw as sensationalism. The Historical Society issued a formal statement distancing itself from the claim. Even the State Library Board removed the Gazette issue from circulation, citing lack of evidence. Yet behind the scenes the rumour persisted, quietly crossing into official channels. That same year, Estill County Coroner's Office reopened 3 unresolved disappearances from the 1870s, citing curious similarities in last-seen locations. Among them was Horace Bent, a feed salesman whose wagon was discovered abandoned near the Red Lick Trail in 1874, his belongings intact, save for a missing travel pouch and a flask filled with cloudy liquid. The coroner's handwritten notation, uncovered decades later, reads, "No cause of death, no body recovered." But we've seen the name Morrison before, and then came the false lead. In 1910, a self-proclaimed folklorist named Clem Taggart published a serialized story in the Appalachian Record titled The Morrison Butcher Boys. It was lurid, invented, complete with hooded rituals, moonlit hunts, and long monologues from a matriarch who cooked with love and marrow. The story captivated readers. For months, it was all anyone in the region talked about. Yet by the end of the year, it had achieved what no record or artifact ever had. It pushed the Morrison story into the realm of pulp horror. From that point forward, serious researchers were discredited for even whispering the name. Taggart's story became a smokescreen, not just in public opinion, but in academia. Grants were denied. Files were boxed and shelved. The Appalachian Historical Society suspended its investigation into Morrison artifacts, calling the surrounding interest unscientific and unproductive. But buried beneath Taggart's fiction was a deeper fracture, one that still hadn't healed. That same year, an unnamed archivist filed an anonymous letter to the state attorney's office, referencing a locked trunk found in the society's sub-basement. The letter read, "The names in this box do not match any from census rolls. They are handwritten, not copied. Some are children." To this day, no trunk has been confirmed. The letter vanished from records. The story faded again. But one truth remains. The louder the story became, the more the facts were buried. And in that noise, those who still sought answers, archivists, descendants, honest researchers, found themselves discredited. Their work twisted into ghost stories, their reputations quietly destroyed. That's the cost of exposure, and it's why this story nearly disappeared. By the early 1920s, the Morrison narrative had reached a saturation point, warped by folklore, dismissed by scholars, and buried beneath local fiction. But not everyone turned away. One of the few to return to the source was Dr. Claribel Finch, a forensic pathologist and historical researcher affiliated with the University of Louisville's School of Medicine. Known for her meticulous record reconstructions of 19th century unmarked graves, Finch had a reputation for challenging official histories, not through conspiracy, but through patient excavation. In 1922, she published a confidential report to the Commonwealth Historical Commission, detailing a cross-reference of unidentified remains in eastern Kentucky with missing persons lists drawn from wagon manifests, toll records, and regional newspapers between 1830 and 1850. Her conclusion was stark. 17 disappearances occur. Within a 40-mile radius of Estill Trace, between 1833 and 1847. No wagon, personal item, or animal trace accompanies their loss. 12 were last seen travelling alone. 6 mentioned stopping at an unnamed lodging. This was not a claim of murder. It was a claim of statistical pattern, and one previously obscured by fragmented jurisdiction, poor frontier record-keeping, and overlapping county lines. Finch's report also contained the first official dismantling of the Taggart hoax. She traced the core elements of the Morrison Butcher Boys back to 3 unrelated folktales published in penny pamphlets from western Pennsylvania. Phrases, names, and even the closing line, "And so they dined on mercy," had been lifted nearly verbatim. What was dismissed as fiction, Finch wrote, may have functioned as the mask that preserved a genuine gap in our historical record. Taggart offered fantasy, but beneath it, the real story remained, quieter, stranger, and more difficult to digest. In response to her findings, state historian Everett Madigan reopened the previously frozen Morrison archives. He authorized access to materials long sealed for lack of institutional clarity. Within 2 months, 3 new items emerged. First, a fire-damaged census draft from 1835 listing a household labeled Morrison, East Fork, Estill, with a notation beside the head of household's name, feeder. 3 lodgers, no occupation claimed. Second, a note tucked into a deed margin from 1837, recovered from the Owsley County Registry. The note was unsigned, but recorded in the clerk's hand. Dwelling not taxed. No road permitted through Morrison land by vote of township elders. Request to reroute declined. And third, a letter. This was the most troubling. Dated November 14, 1851, and addressed to Magistrate Collins of Lee County. The letter appears to be a petition, unsigned, hand-delivered, and found decades later folded into the back of the township's yearly expense ledger. It reads, "Please send men, not to punish, but to record. We cannot keep burying what returns. The cellar is full, and we are not monsters. We only serve what's left behind." Finch never publicly released the letter, but a photocopy surfaced in 1954 when her estate was inventoried after her death. It was paperclipped to a handwritten note in her own script. Too early. They won't hear it yet. Her instincts were correct. When Finch's report circulated among state archivists in 1923, the Historical Commission voted not to fund further inquiry, citing competing priorities and potential public misunderstanding. Madigan resigned a year later. But something had shifted. A scientist had returned to the bones, the names, the absences, and found a shape. A quiet truth had emerged. Not a grand horror, not a grotesque myth, but a slow, deliberate pattern of disappearance, of hospitality without paper, of lodging that left no receipt. The story, when stripped of fiction, became more chilling, not less. And it posed a question that no office wanted to ask. What happens when the wrong people learn they won't be missed? In 1994, a renovation crew working on the foundation of a long-abandoned church outside Panola, Kentucky unearthed a sealed clay jar buried beneath the northeast corner of the building. Inside, preserved by time and packed tight with cedar shavings, were 2 items: a folded piece of vellum and a small tin locket wrapped in oiled cloth. The vellum, though faded, bore a single sentence in tight calligraphy. 33 in 19. All fed. None named the locket, once cleaned and tested, revealed traces of tallow, iron, and oxidized blood protein. Inside was no photo, but rather a tiny scroll of pressed linen on which was written, barely legible, the phrase, "The stew remembers." Neither item had any parish record. The church, shuttered in 1871 after a fire gutted its steeple, had no burial grounds and no connection to any known Morrison family descendant. And yet, the coordinates matched precisely with a stop noted in a freight ledger from 1846. 1 crate of dry salt pork received from Monsieur Farm, delivered at Church Gate, Redlick Crossing. It was the 3rd time the phrase Emser Farm had surfaced in independent, unrelated transport logs, each corresponding to a point within 40 miles of the original Morrison land. That same year, a private collector in North Carolina purchased a bound ledger of food inventories from an estate sale of a defunct boarding house once operated along the Wilderness Road. Among the entries were mundane kitchen lists: flour, beans, salt, vinegar, except for a recurring entry marked only as G. Each instance of G included the same notation: £2. G received from East House. Confirmed, sweet, no stain. In total, G appeared 22 times between 1836 and 1843, always with similar confirmation notes. The East House was never named, but the proximity to Redlick and the lack of any formal supplier raised eyebrows. When university linguists later examined the ledger, one detail stood out. The phrasing, "sweet no stain," mimics medical language of the time used to describe meat quality after traumatic death. It was not typical for plant or animal inventory. The language matched veterinary field assessments, not culinary. A third find deepened the pattern. In 2007, while clearing invasive brush near an abandoned kiln west of Irvine, a group of conservation volunteers unearthed a rusted serving pot sealed with a lead cap. Inside were animal bones, mostly hog, possibly rabbit, but among them one jaw fragment bore a partially intact molar with a gold inlay, a luxury uncommon outside urban centers in the 1830s. The inlay matched a style documented in Louisville Dental Society records from 1832, used only by 2 practitioners statewide. The nearest of the 2 operated 170 miles away. No explanation was offered for how it ended up buried in stew remains inside a pot cast with the faint marking. Property of M. 3 regions, 3 decades, 3 distinct forms of inventory, distribution and burial, all carrying partial, vanishing echoes of the same name. This is where the pattern solidifies. M farm on the freight manifests. G as a recurring meat source in inn records. East House as a known supplier. Tallow preserved objects with lines like all fed and none named. And physical fragments, the locket, the stew pot, the molar, that never belonged together, but ended up buried the same way. These aren't standalone relics. They form a supply chain, not of trade, of people. Even if we reject the darkest interpretation, even if we assume no deliberate harm, no consumption, these artifacts point to a site of disappearance, a mechanism of disposal, and a culture of silence. Something was being taken in and not recorded going out, and someone, somewhere, was counting. Even if they never wrote the names, if the past speaks in fragments, it's up to us to assemble them. Subscribe for more quiet investigations into the stories history did not want told, and the patterns it tried to erase. By the late 2000s, what remained of Morrison's Rest was little more than a shaded patch of uneven soil and a few hand-me-down warnings whispered through rural families. Don't camp near the creek bend. If the hearth is warm, walk on. The East House is not a ruin, it's a memory. Yet despite the decades of folklore and the accumulation of artifacts, no formal excavation had ever taken place. The land, unregistered, unfenced, and passed loosely between heirs who never fully claimed it, remained in a kind of legal limbo. That changed in 2011, when a team of historical geographers from Transylvania University conducted a land survey project intended to identify lost dwellings from the 19th century. The project, funded by a modest state preservation grant, was meant to last 2 weeks. They stayed for 7 months. What caught their attention wasn't the foundation stones, which had long since collapsed. It was the subsoil disturbance pattern, a subtle alignment of compacted clay patches in a cross-like grid. When overlaid with the estimated footprint of the house, the pattern aligned not with walls or walkways, but with what should have been the root cellar and rear dining quarters. Within weeks, the team discovered a stone-lined pit, sealed under packed lime. Inside were glass shards, rusted nails, one bone-handled fork, and a single iron key with the letters LE etched into the shaft. By protocol, the team paused excavation, but someone else had been watching. Within 48 hours, the property owner of record, a man named Curtis Doyle, listed in old deed transfers as a distant cousin of the last Morrison matriarch, filed an injunction. He claimed the land had been misused, and that old stories should stay buried. He won. The dig was halted, the pit recovered, and the site, again, was silenced. But it wasn't just legal resistance that threatened the work. Local response shifted from curiosity to hostility. Equipment was vandalized. Field notes went missing. One volunteer researcher, speaking anonymously, reported receiving a hand-delivered letter with a chilling message. "You are unsealing something that was closed with kindness." The phrase appears nowhere in historical records, but it matches a line from the 1851 anonymous letter discovered in Magistrate Collins' expense ledger. The original line read, "We are not monsters. We only serve what's left behind. You are unsealing something that was closed with kindness." This repetition, nearly 160 years apart, was too precise to be coincidence, and it forced the researchers to confront an unspoken truth. This wasn't just about the past anymore. Whatever had been done at Morrison's Rest, whether out of desperation, belief, or cruelty, had seeded a culture of preservation by silence. A pact, formal or unspoken, stretching generations. There were people, perhaps even descendants, who didn't want the truth unearthed, not because it wasn't real, but because it was. In her final report, project leader Dr. Miriam Clark wrote, "There are moments in research where the archive looks back at you. This was one of them. The ground here is not hostile." But it remembers she concluded the report with a question that went unanswered in funding meetings and academic journals alike. If a place serves kindness through horror, do we honor the kindness or expose the horror? That question echoes beyond academia. It touches on how we handle histories that involve consentless mercy, survival at any cost, and the kind of hunger that does not announce itself with teeth. What remains at Morrison's Rest is not just an unexcavated pit. It is a moral riddle wrapped in soil, and those who approach it must decide, dig for the bones, or listen to the silence. The silence around Morrison's Rest might have held forever, if not for a legal battle that broke out in 2014. A coalition of historians, anthropologists, and local preservationists filed a petition to reopen the halted excavation at the site near Red Lick. Their argument was not about folklore or ghost stories, but about public accountability. If human remains were present, they claimed, they deserved proper recovery and reburial. The petition reached the Kentucky Court of Appeals under the title, Commonwealth vs. Doyle, Land Parcel 113, Furnace Mountain Route. Court transcripts from April 16, 2015, reveal a striking exchange. When asked why the family opposed excavation, Doyle's counsel replied, "Some parts of the past are better remembered by forgetting." Pressed by Judge Harlan Mayfield, the attorney produced a folded paper claiming it was a Morrison family testament. Dated 1856. The document, unsigned, carried one line of instruction. "Seal what is buried, lest the kindness rot into blame." The court ruled narrowly in Doyle's favour, citing private property protections. But in so doing, it entered the phrase Morrison Testament into the official record, the first time the family's name and the question of burial were acknowledged in a state legal proceeding. The ruling backfired. Media attention surged. Small papers from Lexington and Louisville ran cautious headlines about the farm of silence. National outlets sniffed at cannibal folklore, but noted the court's admission of a testament. For the first time in nearly 2 centuries, Morrison's Rest moved from rumour into the shadow of formal recognition. It was then that a new voice entered. Dr. Howard Ellison, a forensic anthropologist retired from the University of Tennessee's renowned Body Farm, offered to conduct a non-invasive survey of the land. Ground-penetrating radar, he argued, would answer the only relevant question. Were there voids consistent with human burial beneath the site? In October 2016, under court-supervised conditions, Ellison's team swept the area. Their report, filed 2 months later, described 11 discrete anomalies beneath the former cellar footprint. Each measured between 5.5 and 6 feet in length, 2 aligned side by side. Soil compression analysis suggested they had been dug and filled more than a century earlier. The report did not claim murder. It did not mention cannibalism. But it closed with one sentence that reverberated. "The ground remembers more than the record allows." For families of the missing, descendants of those whose names appeared in vanished wagon manifests, church rosters, or the Morrison ledger itself, this was the closest thing to reckoning they would ever receive. A recognition that absence had a place, that disappearance left weight in the soil. Yet even here, the silence pressed back. No order was issued to exhume. No DNA was sampled. The voids remain untouched, covered by brush and lime, hidden from sight but not from knowledge. Instead, the reckoning came in a different form: public acceptance of uncertainty. What had once been folklore was now archived in legal proceedings, academic reports, and survey data. Morrison's Rest was no longer a campfire tale. It was a site of record, a place where something happened, something no one wished to name in full. And so the story fractured in two directions. For scholars, it became a case study in how folklore and fact intertwine, each protecting the other, each muddying the trail. For locals, it remained a warning. The same phrases whispered for nearly 200 years still circulate. Don't camp near the creek bend. If the hearth is warm, walk on. Because sometimes reckoning does not mean justice. Sometimes it only means remembering. The court battles of 2015 and the ground survey of 2016 did
not yield prosecutions, nor did they lead to excavation. What they produced, instead, was an administrative ripple, small reforms designed not to resolve Morrison's Rest, but to prevent its silence from repeating elsewhere. In 2017, the Kentucky Historical Commission introduced new protocols for unregistered dwellings and anonymous burials. Any discovery of subsoil anomalies during state-funded construction would now require forensic documentation, regardless of property ownership disputes. A clause, subtle in its drafting, carried the lesson of Morrison's Rest, that private land could hold public consequence. The following year, the University of Louisville's History Department launched a special seminar titled Ghosted by the Record: Case Studies in Absent Archives. Morrison's Rest was the first module. Students read from the 1851 anonymous letter, Finch's 1922 report, and Ellison's 2016 survey. The purpose was not to prove cannibalism or murder, but to teach methodological humility, how historians handle silence, and how to resist the urge to sensationalize absence into myth. But reforms rarely run clean. In 2019, preservationist groups filed a new petition to protect the Morrison site as a historical landscape of concern. The bid failed after landowner Curtis Doyle argued that official designation would bring trespassers, vandals, and seekers of ghoulish tourism. His point was not unfounded. By then, online forums had begun circulating exaggerated accounts of Morrison's Rest, including fabricated photographs of bone cellars and cooking pits. The commission voted down the designation, unwilling to encourage the spread of exploitation. Still, something had shifted in public consciousness. When the Lexington Herald ran a retrospective piece in 2021, summarizing the nearly two-century trail of Morrison mentions, they ended not with folklore, but with a careful line. If silence is a record, Morrison's Rest remains one of Kentucky's oldest. It was a recognition, quiet, sober, and long overdue, that history does not always hand us bodies or verdicts. Sometimes it hands us voids, which demand as much respect. And perhaps that is the truest outcome of this long and fractured story, not a sensational revelation, but a slow acknowledgement of absence as fact. A ledger with names that never reached their destinations. A physician's note about a patient who vanished before his eyes. Artifacts etched with initials no census could confirm. Soil depressions that align with graves never exhumed. Together, they do not prove cannibalism or ritual or even deliberate crime. But they prove something. That Morrison's Rest was not just a tale. It was a place where lives intersected, then disappeared. The reforms ensure that future sites like this, when uncovered, will not slip back into obscurity. Yet they also underscore a painful reality. For Morrison's guests, recognition came too late. Their names remain ink on fading pages, their belongings scattered in attics, their bones, if present, still held in the soil. And so the outcome is partial, like all reckonings. There was no trial, no headline verdict, no last confession. Instead, there was the quiet establishment of safeguards, a fragile shield for the future. The past remains unresolved. As Dr. Clark, who led the halted 2011 dig, once said in a later interview, "We didn't find justice, we found memory, and sometimes that has to be enough." If stories like this matter to you, stories that refuse easy endings, but leave us with haunting silences, subscribe for more. Because the past does not always close. Sometimes it waits. For all the ledgers, artifacts, court filings and surveys, Morrison's Rest remains a story of questions unanswered. Perhaps the most haunting of them all is the simplest. Who were the missing? The ledger found in 1901 lists 314 names. Fewer than 20 have ever been cross-verified against missing person notices or church rosters of the 1830s and 1840s. The rest, nearly 300 entries, belong to no census, no tax roll, no probate record. Were they aliases? Were they never real? Or were they travelers so poor, so rootless, that history never wrote them down? One archivist put it bluntly in a 1978 memo. Either the ledger is fabricated, or we must admit there are entire communities whose lives were never archived at all. Then there is the question of the Morrison family itself. The 1835 census draft, scorched but legible, lists Morrison, East Forcastil, with 3 lodgers. Beyond this, no document confirms their existence. No gravestones, no marriage records, no probate filings. Did the family vanish as cleanly as their guests? Or were Morrison and Morrison convenient names for a house that wished to remain nameless? The anonymous 1851 letter, found decades later in the Lee County expense ledger, raises even sharper questions. We cannot keep burying what returns. The cellar is full. What was returning? Bodies, belongings, memories. The language is opaque, its meaning lost. Without context, it teeters between confession and metaphor. And what of the 11 anomalies beneath the cellar footprint revealed by Dr. Ellison's 2016 ground survey? If they are graves, why leave them untouched? Legal ownership, local resistance, or a deeper, more unsettling hesitation, an unspoken sense that digging might disturb more than soil? Then there are the scattered artifacts, the serving tray marked "For the guests who stay," the knives carved with initials, the stew pot with its gold-inlaid molar. Each is catalogued, each authenticated to the period. But together they form a riddle without an answer. Why were they hidden, and why in such fragmented fashion across counties and decades? Was it coincidence? Or was someone deliberately scattering the evidence, one piece at a time, to keep the whole from ever being seen? Finally, the greatest unknown. Was Morrison's Rest truly a place of deliberate harm? The folklore says yes. Guests served as food, ledger marks as tally. The artifacts whisper it faintly in inscriptions and initials. But the record itself stops short. No sworn confession, no trial, no coroner's ruling, only silence and suggestion. Which leaves us with the most difficult truth. Sometimes history resists certainty, not because we lack evidence, but because the evidence itself was designed to dissolve. Dr. Miriam Clark, reflecting on the halted 2011 excavation, described the feeling in her notes. This site does not want to yield. Its absence is its preservation, and that may be the point. So the Morrison story ends, not with justice nor clarity, but with a void, a farmhouse without a county, a ledger without conclusions, a pit beneath the cellar that remains closed, and perhaps that is why it lingers. Not because we know what happened there, but because we never will. The story of Morrison's Rest closes not with a verdict, but with a silence that has carried for nearly 2 centuries. It is a silence pressed into soil, folded into ledgers, and sewn into artifacts that should never have been found. What remains is not a full account, but fragments. A name circled in a physician's ledger. A tray inscribed for "the guests who stay." A molar in a stew pot, inlaid with gold from a city 170 miles away. An anonymous letter begging for men to record, not to punish. And beneath it all, 11 dark shapes still sealed in the cellar earth. Together they do not confirm a crime, but they confirm a place. And that may be enough. Because places like Morrison's Rest are not supposed to exist. Inns are supposed to carry receipts, roads are supposed to carry maps, and lives are supposed to carry records. Yet here, in this corner of eastern Kentucky, a house seemed to operate outside of all three. No maps, no receipts, no endings, only arrivals. It leaves us with a haunting image, the steady flow of travelers in the 1830s and 1840s, some pausing at a white farmhouse at the edge of a ridge. They eat warm stew. They rest by the fire. They never appear again in the census, in the toll books, or in the court registries. But their names are written, page after page, in a ledger hidden in a chimney. And when the ledger runs out of space, the pages stop. Was this erasure intentional? Was it ritual? Was it born of desperation in a time when frontier hunger blurred moral lines? Or was it simply the cruelty of people who learned that silence could cover any act? We do not know, and perhaps we never will. That uncertainty is its own weight. Morrison's rest endures not because of what we've proven, but because of what remains unprovable. Its power lies in what resists excavation. The artifacts whisper, but never shout. The ground swells with shapes, but never yields bones. The records record just enough to trouble, never enough to resolve. And so the farm remains, at once forgotten and unforgettable. Dr. Clarabelle Finch, the researcher who first dismantled the Taggart hoax, wrote one line in the margin of her private notes: "Some stories survive by refusing to be finished." Morrison's Rest is one of those stories. It survives because it cannot end. The farmhouse is gone, the Morrison name untraceable, the court records scattered. But the silence remains. And silence is not emptiness. It is presence, heavier, sometimes, than words. So tonight, as we leave the trail of ledgers, knives, stew pots, and cellar pits behind, we're left with one question that lingers longer than any proof. If the kindness of strangers can conceal horror, how can we ever know where safety ends and silence begins? That question has no easy answer, but it is why stories like this must be told, not to close them, but to hold them open. Thank you for walking with me through this excavation of silence. If you found value in these difficult stories, subscribe for more explorations of history's darkest corners. And tell me, do you believe Morrison's Rest was ever real? Or is it the silence itself that keeps it alive?